The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail that wound its way toward the Bighorn Mountains, baking the earth into hard-packed clay that sent up small clouds of dust with every step of the weary horse. Ivy Malone shifted in her worn saddle, wincing at the ache in her lower back that had been her constant companion for the past 3 days. Her mare, a sway-backed creature she'd bought with the last of her money in Casper, plodded along with its head low, as exhausted as its rider. She pulled the brim of her husband's old hat lower over her eyes, squinting against the harsh Wyoming sun. The year was 1883, and the territory was as unforgiving as the people who inhabited it. Her dress, once a respectable navy blue, was now faded and coated with trail dust. The hem was torn in several places from catching on sagebrush and rocks. She'd given up trying to maintain any semblance of propriety days ago. Out here, survival mattered more than appearances. Behind her, somewhere in that vast expanse of prairie and broken dreams, lay the town of Willow Creek and the grave of her husband, Samuel. The thought of him brought no grief, only a mixture of relief and fear that coiled in her stomach like a rattler preparing to strike. She unconsciously touched her ribs where the bruises had finally faded to yellow-green shadows. The last gifts Samuel had given her before his death. It had been an accident, she told herself for the 100th time. He'd been drunk again, angrier than usual about some perceived slight at the saloon, when he'd come at her with the poker from the fireplace. She'd only meant to push him away, but Samuel, unsteady from whiskey, had stumbled backward, his head striking the corner of the iron stove with a sickening crack. She'd stood there for what felt like hours, watching the blood pool beneath his head, waiting for him to get up and resume his assault. But Samuel Malone never rose again. And when his brother, Judge Theodore Malone, had arrived the next morning for their weekly breakfast, he'd taken one look at the scene and declared her a murderess. "You'll hang for this," he'd said, his cold eyes so like Samuel's. "I'll see to it personally." That had been 5 days ago. 5 days of hard riding, little sleep, and constant glances over her shoulder. She'd taken only what she could carry: Samuel's pistol, a bedroll, some hardtack and jerky, and the small leather pouch containing her mother's wedding ring, the only thing of value Samuel hadn't sold or gambled away. The mare stumbled, jolting Ivy from her dark thoughts. They were approaching a small creek that cut through the landscape, its banks lined with cottonwoods that offered the first real shade she'd seen in hours. The sight of water made her realize how parched her throat was. She'd been rationing her water, unsure when she'd find the next source. She dismounted stiffly, her legs trembling as they took her weight, leading the mare to the water's edge. She let the animal drink first while she stretched her aching muscles. The creek was shallow but clear, bubbling over smooth stones worn round by countless years of flowing water. She knelt upstream from the horse, cupping the cool water in her hands and drinking deeply. The relief was immediate. She splashed water on her face and neck, feeling almost human again. For a moment, she allowed herself to rest, sitting back on her heels and closing her eyes. The cottonwood leaves rustled overhead in a slight breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its territorial song. That's when she heard it, a sound that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. The distinctive rattle was unmistakable, even to someone who'd spent most of her life in town. She opened her eyes slowly, afraid that any sudden movement might provoke an attack. The rattlesnake was coiled less than 3 feet from where she knelt, its triangular head raised and swaying slightly, forked tongue tasting the air. It was a big one, thick as her wrist, with a rattle that spoke of many years surviving in this harsh land. Its eyes were cold and unblinking, fixed on her with predatory focus. Ivy's hand instinctively moved toward Samuel's pistol at her hip, but she knew she'd never draw it in time. The snake was too close, too ready. One strike and she'd be dead within hours, alone in this wilderness with no one to mourn her passing. Perhaps it was fitting, she thought with bitter irony. She'd escaped one kind of venom only to meet another. She tried to ease backward slowly, but her skirt had caught on a piece of driftwood. The slight tugging motion seemed to agitate the snake further. Its rattle increased in intensity, filling the air with that terrible sound that spoke of imminent death. "Easy there," she whispered, though whether to the snake or herself, she wasn't sure. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the shade. She could see the snake's muscles bunching, preparing to strike. This was it, then. This was how Ivy Malone would meet her end, not at the end of a hangman's rope, but from the fangs of a creature that neither knew nor cared about her sins. The gunshot cracked through the air like thunder, making her cry out in shock. The snake's head exploded in a spray of blood and tissue, its body writhing in death throes before finally going still. Ivy remained frozen, her ears ringing from the shot, unable to process what had just happened. "You'd best watch where you're kneeling, ma'am, this time of day. Rattlers like to cool themselves by the water." The voice was deep, gravelly, with the kind of accent that spoke of Texas origins worn smooth by years of wandering. Ivy turned her head slowly, still afraid to make any sudden movements, even though the snake was clearly dead. A man stood on the slight rise above the creek bank, a smoking Colt .45 still in his hand. He was tall, she noted, with the kind of lean, hard build that came from years of working cattle and sleeping under stars. His face was shadowed by a black Stetson, but she could see a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. He wore typical cowboy attire, worn leather chaps over faded denims, a blue work shirt with rolled sleeves that revealed forearms corded with muscle and marked by old scars, and boots that had seen better days. But it was his eyes that caught her attention as he made his way down the bank toward her. They were gray, like storm clouds, and held a wariness that matched her own. This was a man who'd learned not to trust easily, who kept his guard up even when performing acts of kindness. He holstered his weapon with practiced ease and extended a hand to help her up. "Can you stand?" Ivy nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. She accepted his hand, rough with calluses, strong but surprisingly gentle, and let him pull her to her feet. Her legs shook, whether from the close call or the long days in the saddle. She couldn't tell. "Thank you," she managed, her voice hoarse. I didn't see it until—" "They blend in right well with the rocks," he said, already turning away to examine the dead snake. He picked up a stick and flipped the carcass over, studying it with the detached interest of someone who'd seen plenty of death. "Big one, 6 feet, maybe 7. You're lucky." Lucky. Ivy almost laughed at that. Lucky would have been marrying a kind man instead of Samuel. Lucky would have been having children to love instead of bruises to hide. Lucky would have been anywhere but here, in the middle of nowhere, running from a murder charge with only a worn-out horse and a dead man's gun for company. The cowboy, for that's clearly what he was, moved to where his own horse waited, a beautiful bay gelding that looked like it could run for days without tiring. Everything about him spoke of competence, from the well-maintained tack to the bedroll neatly secured behind his saddle. This was someone who knew how to survive out here. "You traveling alone?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Those storm-gray eyes took in her appearance, the torn dress, the exhausted horse, the way she kept glancing back down the trail. "Yes," she said simply. There seemed no point in elaborating. He nodded, asking no further questions. That was another thing about the frontier. People minded their own business. Everyone had secrets, reasons for being where they were. Questions were considered impolite at best, dangerous at worst. "Trail gets rough heading into the mountains," he said, checking his saddle's cinch. "There's talk of early storms coming down from the north. You got somewhere specific you're headed?" "My cousin has a place near Buffalo." She lied smoothly. She had no cousin, no destination beyond away. But she'd learned that people were less likely to remember a woman with a purpose than one who was simply running. He swung up into his saddle with an easy grace that spoke of a lifetime spent on horseback. For a moment, she thought he would simply ride away, leaving her to continue her flight alone. Instead, he looked down at her with those careful eyes. "Buffalo's a fair piece from here. 2, maybe 3 days if you push hard." He glanced at her mare, and she could see his assessment in the slight frown that creased his brow. "That horse won't make it pushing hard. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered without judgment. Ivy felt tears prick at her eyes, the first she'd felt since Samuel's death, not from grief or fear, but from the simple kindness of a stranger who'd saved her life and was now trying, in his oblique way, to help her further. "I'll manage," she said, lifting her chin with a pride she didn't feel. He touched the brim of his hat in farewell. "Mind the snakes," he said, and turned his horse toward the mountains. Ivy watched him go, noting the way he sat his saddle, the rifle in its scabbard, the practiced way he scanned the horizon even as he rode. When he was perhaps 50 yards away, she saw his horse stumble slightly, saw him dismount to check its hooves. He seemed to find something, a stone, perhaps, and spent several minutes working to remove it. By the time she'd watered her mare and refilled her canteen, he was mounting up again. Their eyes met across the distance, and he touched his hat brim once more before continuing on his way. It wasn't until he'd disappeared over a rise that she realized he'd been traveling in the opposite direction when he'd stopped to help her. The stone in his horse's hoof had been a fiction, a way to stay close without seeming to, until he was sure she was safe. The tears came then, hot and unexpected. She cried for the kindness of strangers, for the life she'd left behind, for the uncertain future that stretched ahead like the dusty trail. When she finally mounted her tired horse and continued toward the mountains, she noticed something else, fresh horse tracks leading in her direction, then veering off toward a parallel trail that would intersect hers further ahead. The cowboy was keeping pace with her, staying just out of sight but close enough to help if needed. She didn't know whether to be comforted or concerned. In her experience, men who followed women usually wanted something. But then again, her experience was limited to Samuel and his ilk. Perhaps there were still good men in the world, men who helped simply because it was right. As her mare plodded forward and the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Ivy Malone allowed herself a moment of hope. She was alive, against all odds. She'd escaped Samuel, survived Judge Malone's threats, and been saved from a rattlesnake by a mysterious cowboy with storm-gray eyes. The mountains loomed ahead, purple in the distance, promising shelter and danger in equal measure. Behind her, the past pursued with the relentlessness of a wronged man's kinfolk. And somewhere in the gathering dusk, a lone rider paralleled her course, a guardian angel in worn leather and trail dust. The West was indeed wild, Ivy thought. But perhaps that wildness contained more than just death and hardship. Perhaps it also held the possibility of redemption, of second chances, of lives rebuilt from the ashes of what came before. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, she urged her weary mare forward, toward whatever fate awaited in those distant peaks. The storm rolled in from the north like an angry god, turning the late afternoon sky from blue to bruised purple in a matter of minutes. Ivy had been pushing her exhausted mare up a narrow mountain trail when the first fat raindrops began to fall, cold as ice against her sun-warmed skin. Within moments, the drops became a deluge. Lightning split the sky, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very mountains. Her horse whinnied in fear, dancing sideways on the narrow path. Ivy's hands, slick with rain, struggled to maintain control of the reins. Through the sheets of rain, she caught sight of movement ahead, the cowboy from the creek, his hat pulled low, gesturing urgently for her to follow. She didn't hesitate. Whatever his intentions, they couldn't be worse than being caught in this tempest on an exposed mountainside. He led her off the main trail, picking his way carefully among the rocks and scrub pines. The rain had turned the ground to mud, making each step treacherous. Ivy's mare slipped twice, nearly going to her knees, but somehow managed to keep following the bay gelding ahead, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. A structure materialized through the rain, a small cabin tucked against the mountainside, nearly invisible until you were upon it. The cowboy dismounted quickly, leading his horse to a lean-to shelter attached to one side. He gestured for Ivy to bring her mare there as well. They worked in silence, unsaddling the horses and rubbing them down with handfuls of grass. The lean-to provided some protection from the storm, but the wind drove the rain in sideways, soaking them both to the skin. When the horses were as comfortable as possible, the cowboy picked up both saddles and nodded toward the cabin door. Inside, the darkness was absolute until he struck a match, the small flame casting dancing shadows on rough-hewn walls. He lit a kerosene lamp hanging from a beam, revealing a single room maybe 12 feet square. It was sparse but clean, a narrow cot against one wall, a small table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and shelves holding a few supplies. "Built this myself 2 winters ago," he said, setting the saddles near the door. "Use it when I'm running cattle up to summer pasture." Ivy stood dripping just inside the doorway, uncertain. Being alone with a strange man went against everything she'd been taught, but what choice did she have? The storm showed no signs of abating, and night was falling fast. He seemed to sense her discomfort. "I'll get a fire going," he said, turning his attention to the fireplace. "There's a blanket in that chest you can use to dry off some." The chest yielded a wool blanket that smelled of cedar and wood smoke. Ivy wrapped it around herself gratefully, though her wet dress beneath continued to chill her. She watched as he built the fire with practiced efficiency, coaxing flames from what looked like damp wood. Soon, warmth began to fill the small space. He fed the fire until it crackled cheerfully, pushing back the gloom and the cold. Only then did he remove his hat, hanging it on a peg by the door, and she got her first good look at him in the light. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 35 to her 28 years. His dark hair was too long, curling slightly where it met his collar. The planes of his face were sharp, weathered by sun and wind, with a day's growth of beard that didn't quite hide a strong jaw. But it was his eyes that held her, gray as the storm outside, holding depths of something she recognized. Pain, loss, the kind of wounds that didn't show on the outside. "Name's Colt," he said finally. "Colt Brennan." "Ivy," she replied, not offering her last name. He didn't seem to expect it. He moved to the shelves, pulling down a coffee pot and a tin. "Coffee'll help warm you up. Haven't got much in the way of food. Some beans. Hardtack. That's kind of you." He glanced at her, something flickering in those storm-gray eyes. "Not much kind about it. Can't very well let you freeze or starve." They settled into an awkward silence as he prepared the simple meal. Ivy remained wrapped in the blanket, slowly warming but acutely aware of her wet clothes beneath. The cabin was too small for real privacy, and she could feel his awareness of her as keenly as she felt her own vulnerability. When the coffee was ready, he poured 2 cups and handed her one. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and she saw him pull back as if burned. He took his own cup to the far side of the small table, maintaining a careful distance. "You weren't really headed to Buffalo," he said. It wasn't a question. Ivy considered lying again, but something about the directness of his gaze made deception seem pointless. "No," he nodded, sipping his coffee. "Running from something or someone? Does it matter?" "Not to me." He studied her over the rim of his cup. "Though that mare of yours won't carry you much farther. Wherever you're going." The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. Without a horse, she was as good as caught. "I don't have money for another," she admitted. "Didn't figure you did." He rose to check the beans warming by the fire. "How long since you ate proper?" She had to think. 3 days, maybe 4. He made a sound that might have been disapproval or sympathy, ladling beans onto 2 tin plates. They ate in silence. The only sounds the crackling fire and the storm raging outside. The beans were plain but hot, and Ivy found herself ravenous once she started eating. "Thank you," she said when she'd cleaned her plate. "For earlier, at the creek, and for this." He shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. Any man would have done the same. "No," she said quietly. "They wouldn't have." Something in her tone made him look up sharply. His eyes traveled over her face, taking in details he'd missed before. The fading yellow-green shadow along her jaw that might have been a bruise. The way she held herself carefully, as if expecting a blow. "Your husband?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "He's dead." The words came out flat, matter of fact. Colt nodded slowly, asking nothing more. He cleared the plates, movements economical and practiced. A man used to taking care of himself, she thought. Used to being alone. The storm continued its assault on the cabin, rain hammering the roof like bullets. Lightning illuminated the oil paper windows in brief, brilliant flashes. In the enclosed space, Ivy became increasingly aware of her wet clothes, the way they clung and chilled, but there was nowhere to change, no privacy to be had. Colt seemed to sense her discomfort. He pulled a shirt from a peg on the wall, worn flannel, soft with age. "This'll be too big, but it's dry," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I'll step outside, give you a moment." In the storm, lean-to will keep the worst off. Need to check the horses anyway. He shrugged into a slicker and stepped out into the tempest, pulling the door shut behind him. Ivy didn't waste time. Peeling off her sodden dress and chemise with trembling fingers, the shirt came nearly to her knees, and she kept her drawers on beneath. It smelled of him, leather and wood smoke, and something indefinably male. She hung her wet things near the fire and was wrapped in the blanket again when he knocked. "Come in," she called. He entered, shaking water from his hat. If he noticed her clothes drying by the fire, he gave no sign. "Horses are fine," he reported. "Storm might blow through by morning." An awkward pause stretched between them. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the cabin's sturdy walls. They were trapped here together, two strangers with their own secrets, their own pain. "I'll take the floor," he said finally. "No." The word surprised her as much as him. "That is, it's your cabin. I'll take the floor. My mother would tan my hide if she knew I let a lady sleep on the floor." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Been gone 10 years now, but I still hear her voice sometimes." "What was she like?" Ivy found herself asking. He settled into one of the chairs, stretching long legs toward the fire. "Tough as boot leather, gentle as spring rain. Came out from Missouri as a bride, bore 8 children. Only 3 of us lived to grow up." His voice carried old grief, worn smooth by time. "Comanche's got my brother. Fever took my sister. Just me left now." "I'm sorry." He shrugged. "The way of things out here. What about you? Family? None that would claim me now." The words held more truth than she'd intended to reveal. They lapsed into silence again, but it was less awkward now. The fire popped and settled. Rain continued its steady drumming. In the warm, close space, Ivy felt herself relaxing for the first time in days, weeks, maybe. When had she last felt safe? "My wife died 2 years ago," Colt said suddenly, staring into the fire. "Fever took her while I was away with a herd. Came back to a grave and a town full of folks who thought I'd abandoned her." His hands tightened on his coffee cup. "Some said worse than that." Ivy understood then, the recognition of one wounded soul to another. They'd both been marked by loss, by accusations, by the judgment of others. Perhaps that's why he'd helped her, not from simple kindness, but from understanding. "I didn't kill my husband," she heard herself say. "Not the way they're saying. He drank. Got mean when he did that last night. He came at me with a poker. I pushed him away, and he fell, hit his head on the stove." She drew a shaky breath. "His brother's a judge. Said he'd see me hang for murder." Colt's expression didn't change. Man who'd raise a hand to a woman deserves what he gets. The simple acceptance in his voice nearly undid her. No questions, no doubt, just a straightforward assessment that Samuel had brought his fate upon himself. Tears pricked her eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. "Storm's letting up some," he said, though the rain still pounded steadily. He rose, pulled another blanket from the chest. "You take the cot. I've slept in worse places than a dry floor." This time she didn't argue. Exhaustion pulled at her like a physical weight. She curled on the narrow cot, still wrapped in the blanket, and watched as he made himself a pallet near the fire. "Colt," she said softly. He turned his head toward her. "Why did you really follow me from the creek?" In the firelight, she could see him consider his answer. Seen too many folks come to grief in these mountains, he said finally. Didn't seem right, letting you ride into a storm alone. It wasn't the whole truth, she sensed, but it was enough. She closed her eyes, listening to the storm and the fire, feeling safer than she had in years. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges, but tonight she was warm and dry, and for the first time since Samuel's death, she wasn't alone. As sleep claimed her, she thought she heard him say something else, too quiet to make out over the rain. It might have been, "You reminded me of her," or it might have been only the wind. Either way, she slept, and for once, her dreams were free of blood and accusation. The storm raged on, sealing them in their small shelter against the world. Two damaged souls, brought together by chance and circumstance, beginning to discover that sometimes the most dangerous storms were the ones that raged within. The morning dawned clear and cold, with that crystalline quality that comes after a storm has washed the world clean. Ivy woke to the sound of Colt moving quietly about the cabin, trying not to disturb her. She lay still for a moment, savoring the unusual feeling of having slept deeply without fear. "Coffee's on," he said when he noticed her stirring. He was already dressed, his hair damp as if he'd washed in the stream. She sat up, suddenly aware of wearing only his shirt and her undergarments. The blanket had slipped during the night. He turned his back, busying himself at the fire, giving her a moment to compose herself. Her dress had dried by the fire, though it was stiff and still showed the wear of hard travel. She pulled it on quickly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. When she turned back, he was holding out a cup of coffee, his eyes carefully fixed on her face. "Trails washed out in places," he said. "Checked it early this morning. It'll be a day or two before it's passable." The implication settled over her like a weight. Another day here, maybe two. Another day for Judge Malone's men to close the distance. "I need to keep moving," she said, though even she could hear the futility in her voice. "On that mare? After yesterday's push?" He shook his head. "She's favoring her left front leg this morning. Needs rest." Ivy's hands tightened on the coffee cup. Without a horse, she was trapped. The mountain wilderness stretched for miles in every direction. Impossible to navigate on foot. "I'll teach you some things," Colt said unexpectedly. "Skills that might help, wherever you're going." She looked at him in surprise. "Why?" He shrugged, uncomfortable with the question. "Got nothing else to do while we wait for the trail to clear." That's how Ivy found herself learning to read the subtle marks that showed where animals had passed, which plants were safe to eat, how to find water in dry country. Colt was a patient teacher, his voice low and steady as he pointed out details she would have missed entirely. "See here?" He knelt by a muddy patch near the stream. "Wolf tracks. Probably came through early this morning, heading higher into the mountains. And there, deer crossed maybe an hour ago. See how the edges of the print are still sharp?" She knelt beside him, trying to see what he saw. Their shoulders brushed, and she felt him tense slightly before easing away. Always that careful distance, she noticed, always maintaining propriety, even in their strange circumstances. As the morning progressed, he showed her how to set a simple snare for rabbits, how to bank a fire so it would last through the night, how to tell direction by the sun and stars. Practical things, survival things. The kind of knowledge that might keep a person alive in wild country. "You know all this from cowboying?" she asked as they walked back to the cabin. "Some. Learned more from an old Apache who worked for my father when I was a boy. Taza. His name was... He'd been a warrior before the treaties. Knew every inch of this country." A fond smile touched his lips at the memory. "My mother was scandalized when he started teaching me tracking, but father said it might save my life someday. He was right." They spent the afternoon by the fire, Colt showing her how to load and clean Samuel's pistol properly. She'd fired it before. Samuel had insisted she know how, though more for his amusement than her protection, but she'd never really understood the weapon. "It's a .32, Colt said, examining it with professional interest. "Good gun for a woman, not too heavy, decent stopping power at close range. But you need to keep it clean, especially in dust and rain." His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he broke down the weapon, explaining each part. Ivy watched, mesmerized by the competence in those scarred fingers. When he handed it back for her to try, their hands touched again. And this time, neither pulled away immediately. "Your husband teach you to shoot?" he asked. "After a fashion." She concentrated on reassembling the pistol, not wanting to see his expression. "He thought it was amusing, watching me flinch at the noise." "Man sounds like he was a fool," Colt said quietly. "Weapon's only good if you can use it without fear." That evening, they sat by the fire again, sharing another simple meal. The cabin felt smaller somehow, the awareness between them growing with each passing hour. Ivy found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, the way firelight played across his features, the careful grace of his movements, the way his eyes softened when he thought she wasn't watching him in return. "Tell me about your wife," she said impulsively. "If you don't mind." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, Sarah. Her name was Sarah. Pretty as a spring morning, with yellow hair and eyes blue as cornflowers. His voice carried old pain, old love. "Met her at a church social in Cheyenne. I was just up from Texas with a herd. Figured to head back soon as we got paid. But one dance with her and I was lost." Ivy understood that feeling, being lost to someone, though in her case, it had been a trap rather than a blessing. "We married that fall," he continued. "I took work at a local ranch, built her a little house in town. She wanted children, but—" He paused, swallowing hard. 2 years we tried. She lost 3 babies before they could draw breath. Each one took a piece of her with it." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, answered by another. "That last winter, she begged me not to go with the spring drive, said she had a feeling, but we needed the money. And I thought—" He laughed bitterly. "I thought I knew better. When I came back 6 weeks later, she'd been in the ground for a month. The fever took her quick, they said, but some folks whispered she'd done it herself, out of grief for the babies." "That's cruel," Ivy said softly. "People are cruel when they don't understand something. And they didn't understand Sarah. Didn't understand us." He met her eyes across the fire. "They said I'd abandoned her, left her to die alone. Said I cared more for cattle money than my wife. Some even said I'd known she was sick and left anyway." Now she understood the wariness in his eyes, the careful distance he maintained. He'd been marked by suspicion just as she had, branded by the judgment of others. "Is that why you live out here alone?" "Part of it. Can't stomach the looks, the whispers. Out here, there's just the work and the weather. Honest things." He added another log to the fire. "What about you? Where will you go?" It was the first time he'd asked directly about her plans. Ivy found she wanted to tell him the truth. "I don't know. Away from Texas. Away from anywhere the Malone name carries weight. Maybe California, maybe Oregon. Somewhere I can start over. It's hard country for a woman alone. It's hard country for anyone alone," she countered. He nodded acknowledgement of that truth. They sat quietly, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire burned lower, and Ivy found herself yawning despite her desire to prolong the evening. "Should turn in." Colt said, "Want to check that trail early, see if it's drying out." As they prepared for sleep, she in the cot, he on his pallet by the fire, Ivy felt a strange reluctance. Tomorrow or the next day, the trail would clear. She'd ride on, and he'd return to his solitary life. This interlude, this unexpected sanctuary, would end. "Colt," she called softly in the darkness. "Thank you for everything." She heard him shift on his pallet. "Get some sleep, Ivy." But sleep eluded her for a long time. She lay listening to his breathing, to the night sounds outside the cabin, to the voice in her heart that whispered dangerous things. She barely knew this man, yet she felt safer with him than she'd ever felt with Samuel. There was strength in Colt Brennan, but it was tempered with gentleness. He'd known loss and pain, yet hadn't let it turn him bitter. sometime near dawn. She woke to find him gone. Panic seized her for a moment before she heard his voice outside, talking low to the horses. She rose and peered out the window, seeing him in the gray pre-dawn light, checking her mare's leg with gentle hands. When he came back in, she was building up the fire. He seemed surprised to find her awake. "How is she?" Ivy asked. "Better. Another day's rest and she should be sound." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "There's another option. I've got a spare horse at my line camp, about a day's ride north. Nothing fancy, but solid and trail-wise. You could take him." The offer stunned her. Horses were valuable, sometimes the difference between life and death in this country. "I can't pay you." "Didn't ask for payment." "Then why?" He removed his hat, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she was beginning to recognize as nervousness. "Because you need help, and I'm in a position to give it." "Because—" He stopped, searching for words. "Because I know what it's like to run from something that's not your fault." Tears pricked her eyes. In all her life, no one had ever offered her help without expecting something in return. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll take the horse. Give that mare of yours a chance to rest proper." She nodded, not trusting her voice. He turned away, busying himself with breakfast, but she saw the tension ease from his shoulders. They spent that day much as the previous one, him teaching, her learning. But there was a new ease between them, as if his offer had broken down some invisible barrier. She found herself laughing at a story he told about a greenhorn who'd tried to rope a bear, thinking it was a cow in the dark. He smiled more, the expression transforming his weathered features. As evening approached, they sat outside the cabin, watching the sun paint the mountains gold and crimson. The beauty of it caught at Ivy's throat. She'd been so focused on running, on surviving, that she'd forgotten the world could still hold such moments of grace. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It is." But when she glanced at him, he wasn't looking at the sunset. The moment stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. Then Colt cleared his throat and stood. "Better get supper started." That night, as they settled into their respective beds, Ivy made a decision. Tomorrow, they'd go to his line camp. He'd give her a horse, and she'd ride out of his life. It was the smart thing, the safe thing. But lying there in the dark, listening to him breathe, she wondered if she'd ever feel safe again once she left this cabin. Left him, somewhere between that first gunshot at the creek and this quiet evening. Colt Brennan had become more than just a rescuer. He'd become the first person in years to make her believe she might be worth saving. They set out at first light, leading the horses through terrain still muddy from the storm. Ivy's mare seemed grateful for the slow pace, and Colt's bay picked his way carefully among the rocks and washouts. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. "Line camp's in a box canyon about 8 miles north," Colt explained as they rode. "Good water, grass for the horses. I use it during spring roundup." They traveled in companionable silence, following game trails and old Indian paths that wound through the mountains. Ivy found herself memorizing the way he sat his horse, the quiet confidence in every movement. Soon, she told herself, soon she'd be alone again, and these memories would be all she had. By midday, they were climbing toward a narrow pass between two peaks. The trail was treacherous here, barely wide enough for a single horse, with a steep drop on one side. Colt went first, testing each section before motioning her forward. They were halfway through when her mare stumbled on loose shale. For a heart-stopping moment, Ivy felt herself sliding toward the edge. Then Colt's hand shot out, grabbing her horse's bridle, steadying both mount and rider with surprising strength. "Easy now," he murmured, though whether to her or the horse, she couldn't tell. "Just breathe. We're almost through." When they finally reached safer ground, Ivy realized she was shaking. Not from the near fall, but from the protective fierceness she'd seen flash across his face in that moment of danger. The line camp sat in a small canyon as promised, a rough structure of logs and stone that looked like it had grown from the landscape itself. A small corral held 3 horses that raised their heads at their approach, whinnying greetings. "That's sorrel gelding," Colt said, pointing to a sturdy-looking horse with a white blaze. "He'll do you fine. Name's Pepper. Not fast, but he'll go all day without complaint." They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for her departure. Colt checked Pepper's hooves, adjusted the spare saddle to fit Ivy better, packed her saddlebags with provisions, all practical things, all necessary. Yet each task felt like another step toward an ending neither seemed eager to reach. As the sun began its descent, they built a fire outside the camp. The night would be cold at this elevation, and they'd need to keep it burning. Colt had shot a rabbit earlier, and they roasted it over the flames, the simple meal feeling like a feast. "I should reach Buffalo in 2 days," Ivy said, maintaining the fiction of her destination. "There's a boarding house on 2nd Street, he offered, run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson. She's fair and doesn't ask questions." She filed the information away, though she had no intention of going to Buffalo. Too close, too easy to track. But she appreciated his concern, the way he was still trying to help even as he prepared to let her go. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun set. They moved closer to the fire, and somehow she couldn't say who moved first. They were sitting side by side, shoulders touching. The contact sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with the flames. "Will you be all right?" she asked quietly. "Going back to being alone?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Been alone for 2 years. Got used to it. That's not what I asked." He turned to look at her then, firelight dancing in those storm-gray eyes. "No," he said simply. "No, I don't think I will be." The honesty of it took her breath away. She reached out without thinking, placing her hand over his where it rested on his knee. He went very still, then slowly turned his hand to intertwine their fingers. "Ivy," he said, her name rough in his throat. "I need to tell you something, about Sarah, about what really happened." She squeezed his hand gently, encouraging him to continue. "She was sick before I left. Not the fever, something in her mind. The lost babies, they changed her. She'd have days where she didn't know me, didn't know herself. I should have seen it, should have stayed." His voice cracked slightly. "The doctor said later that the fever was a mercy. Said she was suffering something fierce in her mind, but I wasn't there. I left her alone with her demons because I thought providing for her meant more than being with her." "You couldn't have known," Ivy said softly. "Maybe not, but I made a choice, and I've lived with it every day since." He looked at her intently. "I won't make that mistake again. Won't put duty before what matters." The weight of his words settled between them. Ivy felt her heart racing, understanding what he was trying to say without saying it. In just a few days, something had grown between them, unexpected and undeniable. "Colt," she began, but he placed a finger gently against her lips. "I know you need to go. Know you've got reasons for running that you haven't told me, and that's all right." His hand moved to cup her cheek, thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "But if you ever need help, if you ever need somewhere safe, you come find me. You hear?" She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. He leaned closer, and she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he pressed his forehead against hers, breathing the same air, sharing the same space. They stayed like that for a long moment before pulling apart. The loss of his warmth was almost physical pain. Ivy wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the fire. "We should sleep," he said roughly. "Early start tomorrow." They made their beds on opposite sides of the fire, the space between them feeling like a chasm. Ivy lay awake, watching the stars wheel overhead, listening to the horses shift in the corral and the fire settle into coals. "Are you asleep?" she whispered into the darkness. "No." His voice was closer than she'd expected. He'd moved his bedroll nearer, though still maintaining a respectful distance. "Tell me about Texas," she said. "About where you grew up." So he did, his voice low and soothing in the darkness. He told her about endless horizons and cattle drives, about his mother's garden that she'd coaxed from dry soil, about swimming in the Brazos River as a boy. She found herself sharing two memories of Tennessee before her parents died, before she'd been sent to live with an aunt who saw her as free labor, before Samuel had seemed like rescue instead of another kind of prison. Somewhere in the telling, their hands found each other across the space between their bedrolls. Just that simple touch, fingers intertwined, but it anchored her in a way nothing had in years. She woke at dawn to find him already up, saddling Pepper with slow, reluctant movements. The moment of departure had arrived, and neither of them seemed ready for it. They ate a quick breakfast in near silence, each lost in thoughts they couldn't voice. When the horses were ready and there were no more reasons to delay, they stood facing each other in the cool morning light. "The trail forks about 5 miles north," he said, "all business now. Take the left fork toward Buffalo. Right leads deeper into the mountains' rough country. Easy to get lost." She nodded, memorizing his face, the way the early light caught in his eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his jaw tightened when he was holding back words. He helped her mount Pepper, his hands lingering on her waist a moment longer than necessary. "He responds better to gentle handling," he said, "like most creatures worth knowing." The double meaning wasn't lost on her. She gathered the reins, knowing if she didn't leave now, she might never find the courage. "Goodbye, Colt," she managed. "Take care of yourself. Ivy Malone." She'd never told him her last name, but somehow she wasn't surprised he knew it. This man who noticed everything, who'd seen through her careful lies but helped her anyway. She turned Pepper toward the canyon mouth, not trusting herself to look back. Behind her, she heard him speaking quietly to her old mare, promising to take care of her. It was that small kindness that finally broke her composure. The tears came then, blurring the trail ahead, at the fork he'd mentioned. She paused, left to Buffalo and the uncertain future she'd planned, right into the unknown mountains. She sat there for a long moment, Pepper shifting restlessly beneath her. Then she heard it, hoofbeats on the trail behind her. Her heart leaped, then plummeted as she realized it was coming from the wrong direction. Not from the line camp, but from the south. The direction she'd come from originally, multiple horses, moving fast. Judge Malone's men had found her trail. She kicked Pepper into a gallop, taking the right fork without conscious thought. The mountains might be rough country, but they offered more places to hide than the open trail to Buffalo. Behind her, the hoofbeats grew louder. The chase was on, and this time she was truly alone. But as Pepper stretched into his ground-eating stride, proving Colt's assessment of his stamina, Ivy realized something had changed. She was running again. Yes, but now she had skills she hadn't possessed before. Knowledge of how to survive, how to hide, how to fight if necessary. And somewhere behind her was a man who'd promised she could always come back if she needed help. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had in years. She leaned low over Pepper's neck, urging him deeper into the wild country, and tried not to think about gray eyes and gentle hands and what might have been if she'd been free to stay. The pursuit lasted 3 days. 3 days of hard riding through terrain that grew increasingly treacherous, of sleeping in caves and hollow logs, of eating whatever she could forage while staying one step ahead of the hunters. Pepper proved his worth again and again, picking his way through passages that should have been impossible, never faltering despite the punishing pace. By the third evening, Ivy knew she couldn't run much longer. She was exhausted, down to her last handful of jerky, and Pepper was beginning to show signs of strain. The men following her, she'd counted at least 4, seemed to have an unlimited supply of fresh horses and provisions. She found shelter in a grove of aspens near a small spring, their golden leaves whispering secrets in the evening breeze. As she tended to Pepper, her hands shook with fatigue. She'd managed to lose her pursuers temporarily in a maze of box canyons, but they'd find her trail again. They always did. The crack of a branch made her spin, Samuel's pistol already in her hand. But instead of Judge Malone's men, she found herself facing a familiar figure leading 2 horses, his bay and her old mare, now looking considerably better for her rest. "Colt," she breathed, lowering the weapon. He dismounted in one fluid motion, crossing to her in 3 quick strides. His hands gripped her shoulders, gray eyes scanning her for injury. "Are you hurt?" "No, How did you find me?" "Saw the riders heading north 2 days ago. Recognized one of them, Jake Malone, the judge's younger brother." His jaw tightened. "Figured you might need help after all." The relief of seeing him nearly buckled her knees. She swayed, and he pulled her against his chest, holding her as she trembled with exhaustion and delayed reaction. "How many?" he asked quietly. 4, maybe 5. They're relentless." He pulled back enough to look at her face. "There's an old mining settlement about 10 miles northeast, abandoned now, but defensible. We can make a stand there if we have to." "We?" She searched his face. "Colt, this isn't your fight." "The hell it isn't." The vehemence in his voice surprised them both. He gentled his tone. "You think I could just let them take you after—" He stopped, jaw working. "We need to move. Can you ride?" She nodded, though every muscle protested. He helped her mount Pepper again, then swung up on his bay, leading her mare. They headed into the gathering darkness. The mining settlement materialized out of the night like a ghost town, which essentially it was. A dozen buildings in various states of decay lined what had once been a main street. Colt led them to the most intact structure, a 2-story building that might have been a hotel or boarding house. "Used to be called Fortune's End," he said as they led the horses inside through a doorway that had long ago lost its door. "Silver played out 5 years ago." They settled the horses in what had been the lobby. Then Colt did a quick reconnaissance. He returned with wood for a small fire and the news that the building was solid enough despite appearances. "Windows on all sides upstairs," he reported. "Good sightlines. And there's a back way out through the old kitchen if we need it." Ivy sank down near the fire he'd built in a corner away from the windows. Every bone ached, and she knew she must look a fright, trail dirty, exhausted, her dress torn in several places from branches and rocks. Colt knelt beside her, pressing a canteen into her hands. "When did you last eat?" "This morning, I think." The days had blurred together. He produced hardtack and dried beef from his saddlebags, along with a small pot for coffee. As she ate, he kept watch at the window, rifle close at hand. "They'll come with first light," she said. It wasn't a question. "Probably." He glanced back at her. "Jake Malone's mean as a snake, but not too bright. The others will be hired guns, dangerous, but not necessarily loyal. If we can convince them the price is too high, and if we can't," his expression hardened, "then we make them pay it anyway." They spent the next hours preparing. Colt positioned their supplies and weapons strategically, showed Ivy the escape route, made sure she understood the layout of the building. He was all business now, the competent soldier preparing for battle. But as the night deepened and they took turns keeping watch, the tension between them returned. That electric awareness that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with proximity. During her watch, Ivy studied his face in the firelight as he dozed fitfully, the hard planes and angles she'd memorized, the way his hand stayed close to his gun even in sleep. This man who'd inserted himself into her troubles without hesitation, who'd come after her when it would have been safer to let her go. "You're staring," he said without opening his eyes. Heat flooded her cheeks. "Just keeping watch?" He opened his eyes then, meeting her gaze with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Ivy, there's something I need to say, in case tomorrow—" "Don't—" She moved closer, kneeling beside him. "Please don't talk about tomorrow like that." He sat up, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek. "I've been dead inside for 2 years," he said quietly. "Then you showed up at that creek, and suddenly I could feel again. Scared the hell out of me. Colt, I know you've got no reason to trust another man, especially after what you've been through, but I need you to know, you matter to me. Whatever happens tomorrow, that won't change." The words broke something open inside her. She leaned into his touch, covering his hand with her own. "You matter to me too, more than I thought possible in such a short time." He drew her closer slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. Their lips met in a kiss that was gentle at first, almost hesitant. Then her arms went around his neck, and his hand tangled in her hair, and gentleness gave way to need. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Colt rested his forehead against hers, struggling for control. We need to stay alert." She nodded, though every fiber of her being wanted to throw caution aside. They resumed their positions, keeping watch, but now the air between them hummed with unspoken promises. Dawn came too soon, bringing with it the sound they'd been dreading, horses approaching from the south. Ivy counted hoofbeats. 5 riders, just as she'd thought. Colt was already at the upstairs window, rifle ready. "Stay back from the windows," he instructed, "but keep that pistol handy." The riders appeared at the edge of town, stopping just out of easy rifle range, even at this distance. Ivy recognized Jake Malone's hulking form. He'd inherited the family size, but not the brains, according to town gossip. "Mrs. Malone," Jake called out, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "We know you're in there. Come out peaceful-like, and nobody needs to get hurt." "Including her?" Colt called back. "Somehow, I doubt your brother's interested in a peaceful solution." There was a pause. Then Jake again. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who doesn't take kindly to 5 men chasing 1 woman. Seems a mite unfair, doesn't it?" Ivy could hear the frustration in Jake's voice when he responded. "This ain't your concern. Mister, the woman's a murderer. We're taking her back to face justice." "Whose justice?" Colt's voice was hard as granite. "A kangaroo court run by the dead man's brother. That's not justice. That's vengeance." The men below conferred among themselves. Ivy moved to another window, trying to get a better view. One of the hired guns was circling, looking for another way in. "They're trying to flank us," she told Colt quietly. He nodded, unsurprised. "Let them come. These old buildings are death traps if you don't know the layout." Sure enough, a few minutes later they heard a crash from below, followed by cursing. Colt smiled grimly. "Found the rotted floorboards in the back room. Last chance, Mrs. Malone," Jake called again. "Come out now, or we're coming in shooting." Colt levered a round into his rifle. "Your move, Jake, but you might want to ask your hired help if they're really willing to die for your brother's pride." The response was a gunshot that shattered what remained of a downstairs window. The battle was joined. What followed was a carefully choreographed dance of violence. Colt moved between windows with practiced ease, his shots precise and deadly. One of the hired guns went down in the first exchange, clutching his shoulder. Another took cover as Colt's bullets chewed splinters from his hiding spot. Ivy held her position, watching the stairs and their escape route. When one of the attackers tried to rush the building, she fired Samuel's pistol, the shot going wide but close enough to send him diving for cover. "Good girl," Colt said approvingly, never taking his eyes from his window. The firefight continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence was almost more unnerving than the gunfire. "Jake Malone," Colt called out. "You've got 1 man down, maybe dead, another's wounded. You really want to continue this? For what? Your brother's reputation? He's dead and buried. Let it go." "Can't do that," Jake responded. But some of the belligerents had left his voice. "Family honor's at stake. Your family's honor was lost the first time Samuel raised his hand to his wife." Colt shot back. "Everyone in 3 counties knew what he was. You want to die protecting that?" Ivy heard arguing below. The hired guns were having second thoughts. It seemed good men were hard to find, but dead men were useless to everyone. Finally, Jake called out again. "We're pulling back, for now, but this ain't over." They watched from the windows as the riders collected their wounded and retreated. Ivy counted to make sure. All 5, though 2 were slumped in their saddles. "They'll be back," she said. "Maybe, maybe not." Colt set his rifle aside. Turning to her, Hired guns talk. Word will spread that the price for collecting you might be too high. And Jake, he's not the smartest, but he's not entirely stupid either. He knows continuing this could cost him more than letting it go. The aftermath of violence left them both shaky with unused adrenaline. They made their way back downstairs, checking on the horses, assessing their situation. Colt's planning had paid off. They'd taken no injuries, spent relatively little ammunition. "You handled yourself well," he said as they stood by the horses, cool under fire. "I had a good teacher," she replied, thinking of all he'd shown her in their few days together. He moved closer, his hand coming up to cup her face. "Ivy, I meant what I said last night. Every word. I know." She covered his hand with hers. "So, what happens now?" "Now," he took a breath. "Now I ask you to stop running, to stay with me." The words hung between them, an offer of everything she'd thought she'd never have again. Safety, home, someone who looked at her and saw more than a victim or a possession. "I'm trouble, Colt. You've seen that. Being with me means always looking over your shoulder, always wondering if they'll come back. Then we'll look together," he said simply. "I told you once I was done putting anything before what matters. You matter, Ivy, more than my solitude, more than my ghosts. Stay." She kissed him then, pouring everything she couldn't say into the contact. When they broke apart, she whispered, "Yes." He smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features into something almost boyish. "Then let's get out of here. I know a justice of the peace in Montana who doesn't ask questions and doesn't care about Texas warrants." "Is that a proposal?" "Colt Brennan." "It's a promise," he said, pulling her close again. "If you'll have me." Standing in that ruined building where they'd made their stand, Ivy felt the last walls around her heart crumble. "I'll have you," she said. "For as long as you'll have me." "Forever, then," he murmured against her lips. "Starting now." They rode out of Fortune's End as the sun climbed higher. 3 horses and 2 souls who'd found each other against all odds. Behind them lay the ghosts of who they'd been. Ahead stretched a future neither had dared imagine just days before. The mountains stood witness to their passage, keeping their secrets as mountains do. And if Jake Malone and his men ever rode that way again, they found only empty buildings and the whisper of wind through broken windows, carrying tales of love found in the most unlikely places. The mountains embraced them like old friends as they traveled deeper into the wilderness, leaving the ghost town and its violence behind. They rode for 2 days, following trails Colt knew from years of solitary wandering, stopping only when the horses needed rest. Each mile took them further from Texas justice and closer to something that felt dangerously like hope. On the 3rd morning, they made camp by a crystalline lake surrounded by pines, its surface mirror-smooth in the early light. While Colt tended the horses, Ivy walked to the water's edge, kneeling to wash the trail dust from her face and hands. The woman who stared back at her from the water's surface was a stranger, gaunt from days of hard travel, but with a light in her eyes that hadn't been there when she'd fled Samuel's house. "Beautiful spot," Colt said, coming to stand beside her. "Used to come here when I needed to think, after Sarah died. Something about the quiet helps a man sort through things." "What things did you need to sort through?" she asked, standing to face him. He was quiet for a moment, looking out over the water. "Whether I wanted to keep living, mostly. Whether there was any point to it." He glanced at her, a wry smile touching his lips. "Turns out there was. Just took me a while to find it." The tenderness in his voice made her heart constrict. She reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. "I'm glad you kept living," she said simply. They spent that day in a kind of honeymoon peace, though no vows had yet been spoken. Colt caught trout from the lake, while Ivy gathered wild berries and herbs she remembered from his teachings. They ate their simple meal like it was a feast, sitting close together on a fallen log, shoulders touching. As afternoon gave way to evening, Colt pulled out a small knife and began whittling a piece of pine. Ivy watched his hands work, remembering how gentle they could be despite their strength and scarring. "What are you making?" she asked. "You'll see." He worked in concentrated silence for a while, then held up his creation, a simple wooden ring, smooth and perfectly round. "It's not much, but it'll do until we can find something proper." Her breath caught. "Colt." He slid from the log to kneel before her, taking her hand in his. "Ivy Malone, you came into my life like a storm, shaking me awake when I thought I'd sleep forever. I know we haven't known each other long by most folks' reckoning, but sometimes a man just knows. I knew the moment I saw you by that creek, brave and scared and fighting to survive. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend whatever years I have left proving that not all men are like the one you left behind?" Tears blurred her vision. "Yes," she whispered, then stronger. "Yes, Colt, yes." He slipped the wooden ring onto her finger, then pulled her down into his arms, kissing her with a fervor that left them both breathless. When they finally drew apart, she was sitting in his lap, his arms wrapped around her like he'd never let go. "I love you," he said against her hair. "I should have said it sooner." "I love you too," she replied, marveling at how easily the words came. Words she'd thought she'd never say again, never mean again. They held each other as the sun set over the lake, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. For the first time since Samuel's death, perhaps for the first time in years, Ivy felt truly at peace. That night, they made camp near the lake shore. The weather was mild, the sky clear and studded with stars. They sat by their small fire, planning their future in quiet voices. "There's good land available up in Montana," Colt said. "Cattle country, but far enough from Texas that the Malone name won't mean anything. We could build something there. Start fresh. A real home," Ivy mused, the concept still foreign after years of merely existing in Samuel's house. "With a garden if you want one, maybe some chickens." He pulled her closer against his side. "Children, eventually. If that's something you'd want." She heard the hesitation in his voice, understood it. He'd lost Sarah partly to grief over lost babies. And she'd never dared dream of children with Samuel, had been grateful each month when none came. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Children who'll never know the back of a hand, never wonder if they're loved." "Never," he agreed fiercely. "I swear it, Ivy. Any children we have will know nothing but love." They lapsed into comfortable silence, watching the fire and dreaming their separate dreams that were slowly weaving together into one shared vision. The night sounds of the forest surrounded them, an owl calling, small creatures rustling in the underbrush, the gentle lap of water against the shore. "Colt," Ivy said eventually, "tell me about the worst thing that happened to you, the thing that carved those lines around your eyes." He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Prison. After Sarah died and the town turned against me. Some folks decided I needed more punishment than just shunning. They trumped up charges, said I'd stolen cattle from a neighbor. The judge, he was friends with Sarah's father, gave me 6 months hard labor." His voice had gone flat, emotionless. Chain gang work in summer heat, guards who enjoyed their work too much, men who'd done things that would turn your stomach, and me bunked right alongside them. This scar. He touched his chest where she'd seen the long mark. "Got that from a fellow prisoner who decided I looked too soft. Had to nearly kill him to get him to leave me alone." Ivy pressed closer, offering wordless comfort. She understood now the wariness in his eyes, the careful way he moved through the world. He'd been broken and rebuilt himself, just as she had. "Is that why you live alone in the mountains?" "Part of it. When I got out, couldn't stand the way folks looked at me. Like I was dirty, dangerous, easier to be alone than to see that every day." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Until you looked at me and saw just a man, not an ex-convict, not a wife killer, just a man who could help. You saved my life," she reminded him. "And you saved mine right back," he countered. "Just took me a while to realize I needed saving." The fire burned lower, and the night grew cooler. They prepared for sleep, laying out their bedrolls close together. But as Ivy settled in, Colt remained sitting, staring into the dying flames. "What is it?" she asked. "Just thinking about Jake Malone and his men. They could still come after us. You said they probably wouldn't, that the price was too high. Probably isn't definitely." He turned to look at her, his face serious in the firelight. "I want you to be sure. Ivy, life with me might mean always looking over our shoulders, at least for a while." She sat up, reaching out to touch his face. "I've been looking over my shoulder since I was 15, and my aunt sold me to Samuel as a wife. At least now I'll have someone watching with me." He caught her hand, pressing it against his cheek. "You were 15? "Barely. Samuel was 30 and needed a wife to keep house. My aunt needed the bride price he offered." She shrugged, trying to make light of old pain. "It was a business transaction. I just didn't understand that until too late." The rage that flashed across Colt's face would have frightened her once. Now she saw it for what it was, protective fury on her behalf. "If he wasn't already dead," Colt began. "But he is," Ivy interrupted. "And I'm here, and we have a chance at something better. That's what matters now." He studied her face in the firelight. "How did you get so strong?" "I had to. It was that or die inside." She moved closer, into the circle of his arms. "But I don't want to just survive anymore. Colt, I want to live, really live. With you." He kissed her then, deep and passionate, conveying without words everything he felt. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Soon," he promised. "After we're married proper. I want to do right by you, Ivy, in all ways." She understood and loved him more for it. After years of having her wishes ignored, her body treated as property, having a man who respected her enough to wait was its own kind of healing. They slept close that night, her back pressed against his chest, his arm protective around her waist. She woke once to find him propped on an elbow, watching her in the moonlight. "Can't sleep," she murmured. "Just thinking how lucky I am," he replied. "Go back to sleep, darling. I'm here." Darling, such a simple endearment, but from his lips it sounded like a prayer. She drifted back to sleep feeling safer than she had in years. Morning brought decisions to make. They were still 2 days from the Montana border, 3 from the nearest town with a justice of the peace. Their supplies were running low, and they'd need to stop at a trading post soon. "There's a place about a day's ride north," Colt said as they broke camp. "Run by an old mountain man named Ezekiel. He minds his own business and doesn't ask questions if the price is right." They set out early, following a trail that wound through stands of aspen already turning gold with autumn's approach. Ivy found herself imagining seasons changing in their new home, winters by the fire, springs planting that garden Colt had mentioned, summers watching their children play in the yard. Children, the thought still seemed miraculous, to create life with love instead of duty, to raise young ones in happiness instead of fear. She touched the wooden ring on her finger, smiling at its simple perfection. "Penny for your thoughts," Colt said, noticing her smile. "Just thinking about the future, our future." She glanced at him riding beside her, this man who'd appeared in her darkest hour like an answered prayer. "It still doesn't seem quite real." "It's real," he assured her. "Real as these mountains, real as that ring on your finger, real as my love for you." They reached Ezekiel's trading post late in the afternoon. It was a ramshackle affair of logs and canvas, looking like it might blow away in a strong wind. But the old man who emerged to greet them had shrewd eyes that missed nothing. "Colt Brennan," Ezekiel said, spitting tobacco juice. "Been a while. Heard you'd gone hermit after your woman died. Things change." Colt said mildly, "This is Ivy. We're heading to Montana." Ezekiel's eyes flicked between them, taking in Ivy's rough appearance and the protective way Colt positioned himself. "Running or starting fresh?" "Both," Colt admitted. "Need supplies and information. If you've heard anything from the south." The old man scratched his beard. "Might have heard something about some Texas boys asking around. Seems they lost something and headed home empty-handed. He grinned, showing gaps in his teeth. Course, I don't know nothing about that. Just rumors. Relief flooded through Ivy. If Jake Malone had given up the chase, they might truly be free. They spent an hour at the post, stocking up on supplies and gathering news. Ezekiel, for all his rough appearance, treated Ivy with surprising courtesy, even producing a small mirror so she could tidy her appearance. "You take care of her," the old man told Colt as they prepared to leave. "World's hard enough without good people making it harder on each other." "I intend to," Colt replied, helping Ivy mount Pepper. As they rode away, Ivy felt another piece of fear fall away. They were really going to make it. They were really going to have that life they'd dreamed by the fire. That night, their last in the wilderness before reaching civilization, they camped by a stream. The sound of water over stones was soothing, peaceful. They'd come so far from that first meeting by another stream, when a rattlesnake had brought them together. "No snakes this time," Ivy said, voicing her thoughts. Colt smiled. No snakes. Just us and whatever future we choose to build." "I choose you," she said simply. "Today, tomorrow, always. And I choose you," he replied. "My brave, beautiful Ivy, my salvation." They held each other as the stars came out. Two souls who'd found their way through darkness to this moment of perfect peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, finding that justice of the peace, building their home, creating their life together. But tonight, they had each other in the vast, accepting wilderness that had sheltered their love. The mountains stood eternal around them, guardians of their secret happiness. And somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, not in threat, but in celebration of life continuing despite all odds. Ivy smiled against Colt's chest, understanding the sentiment perfectly. They'd survived. They'd found each other. And now, finally, they could begin to heal. The town of Cedar Ridge, Montana territory, wasn't much to look at. A main street of false-fronted buildings, a church with a crooked steeple, and dust that seemed to coat everything despite the recent rains. But to Ivy, riding in beside Colt after days in the wilderness, it looked like civilization itself. "Justice of the peace is above the general store," Colt said, nodding toward a 2-story building. "Man named Josiah Winters. Fair-minded, from what I hear." They tied their horses at the rail, and Ivy tried to smooth her travel-worn dress. She must look a sight trail dust and torn hems, her hair barely contained despite her best efforts with the small mirror Ezekiel had provided. Colt seemed to sense her concern. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, "like a woman who's survived something and come out stronger." Before she could respond, the door to the general store opened and a woman emerged, middle-aged, with kind eyes and flour dusting her apron. She took in their appearance with the quick assessment of someone who'd seen many travelers pass through. "You folks looking for supplies, or the judge?" she asked directly. "The judge, ma'am," Colt replied, touching his hat brim. Her face softened. "Newlyweds-to-be. Then, he's up the stairs. First door on the right. I'm Mrs. Winters. The judge is my husband." She studied Ivy with motherly concern. "Honey, you look dead on your feet. Why don't you come in back and freshen up a bit while your man talks to Josiah?" Ivy glanced at Colt, who nodded encouragingly, following Mrs. Winters through the store to a small back room. She found herself suddenly overwhelmed by the woman's simple kindness. "There now," Mrs. Winters said, pouring water into a basin. "You wash up, and I'll see if I can't find something to help with that dress. Can't have you getting married looking like you've been dragged through the wilderness, even if you have been." "Thank you," Ivy managed, throat tight with emotion. Mrs. Winters studied her shrewdly. "Running from something, are you? No, don't answer that. Not my business. But that man of yours, he's got the look of someone who'd protect what's his. You'll be safe here," as Ivy washed away the trail dust. Mrs. Winters bustled about, producing a clean shirtwaist and skirt. "My daughters," she explained. She's married and moved to California, but I keep some of her things. You're about the same size. The clothes were simple but clean, and Ivy felt almost human again as she changed into them. Mrs. Winters even helped pin her hair into something resembling respectability. There, the older woman said with satisfaction. Now you look like a bride. They returned to the main store to find Colt deep in conversation with a tall, lean man who must be Judge Winters. Both men rose as the women entered, and Ivy saw appreciation flash in Colt's eyes at her transformed appearance. Miss Malone, Judge Winters said formally. Mr. Brennan has explained your situation. I want to be clear. I don't hold with Texas warrants based on hearsay, and from what I understand, that's all they have on you. You'll be safe in my jurisdiction. Relief flooded through her. Thank you, sir. Now then, the judge continued. I understand you're wanting to be married. I can perform the ceremony, but I'll need to ask you both some questions first. Make sure this is what you both want, free and clear. The next half hour passed in a blur of questions and answers, establishing their identities and intentions. Judge Winters was thorough but kind, and Ivy found herself relaxing under his professional demeanor. Finally, he nodded. Everything seems in order. When would you like the ceremony? Now, if possible. Colt said. We've waited long enough. Mrs. Winters clapped her hands. Oh, but you'll need witnesses. And flowers. A bride should have flowers. She bustled out before anyone could protest. Judge Winters smiled at his wife's retreating form. She does love a wedding. We'd best wait for her to return, or I'll never hear the end of it. While they waited, Colt took Ivy's hand, his thumb rubbing over the wooden ring. Soon you'll have a real one, he promised. This one is real, she said firmly. You made it for me. That makes it worth more than gold. Mrs. Winters returned with an armload of wildflowers and 2 people in tow, the blacksmith and his wife, recruited as witnesses. The small party assembled in the store, pushing aside bolts of fabric and sacks of flour to make space. Dearly beloved, Judge Winters began, and Ivy felt tears prick her eyes. She was really doing this, really marrying a man she'd known less than 2 weeks, but who'd shown her more kindness and respect than her first husband had in years. The ceremony was simple, the traditional words taking on new meaning when spoken between 2 people who'd seen the worst life could offer. When Colt promised to love and cherish her, she heard the weight of that promise. When she vowed to honor and keep him, she meant it with every fiber of her being. I now pronounce you man and wife. Judge Winters concluded. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Brennan. Colt's hands cupped her face gently, his kiss soft and reverent despite their audience. When they parted, both were misty-eyed. Congratulations, Mrs. Brennan, he whispered. Mrs. Brennan. Her new name felt like armor against the past, a shield between who she'd been and who she could become. The witnesses offered congratulations, the blacksmith's wife pressing a small wrapped package into Ivy's hands. Just some biscuits and jam for your travels, she said kindly. Every new bride needs something sweet. They were preparing to leave when the store door burst open. A young man rushed in, eyes wild with excitement. Judge, sheriff's looking for you. Says it's urgent. Something about men from Texas causing trouble at the saloon. Ivy's blood ran cold. Beside her, Colt tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. Judge Winters frowned. What kind of trouble, Billy? They're asking about a woman, saying she murdered someone, that they've got papers for her arrest. Sheriff's got them cooling their heels, but they're mighty insistent. How many? Colt asked quietly. 3 mean-looking fellows, especially the big one. Jake Malone. He hadn't given up after all. Ivy felt the brief happiness of her wedding day crumbling. They'd found her, even here. Judge Winters straightened, authority settling over him like a cloak. Mrs. Winters. Take Mrs. Brennan upstairs. Mr. Brennan, you come with me. Let's see what these Texas gentlemen want. No, Ivy said, surprising everyone. I won't hide, not anymore. I'm your wife now. Colt, we face this together, He searched her face, then nodded slowly. Together, then. They walked to the saloon as a group. Judge Winters leading, word had spread, and townspeople gathered to watch, curious about the drama unfolding. The saloon was crowded, tension thick in the air. Jake Malone stood near the bar, flanked by 2 hired guns. He was dusty and travel-worn, his face set in angry lines. When he saw Ivy, his eyes lit with triumph. "There she is, Ivy Malone. You're under arrest for the murder of Samuel Malone." "It's Ivy Brennan now," Colt said, stepping forward. "And you got no authority here." Jake's face darkened as he took in their joined hands. The protective way Colt positioned himself. "You married her? You married my brother's killer?" "I married a woman who defended herself against a violent drunk." Colt replied evenly. "Your brother got what he deserved." Jake started forward, but the sheriff, a grizzled man with steady eyes, put a hand on his chest. "That's enough, Judge. These men have a warrant from Texas. Says this woman killed her husband." Judge Winters examined the paper Jake thrust at him, taking his time. "This warrant is signed by Judge Theodore Malone. Any relation?" "My eldest brother," Jake admitted grudgingly. "So a family member signed a warrant based on no evidence except his own assumptions." Judge Winters handed the paper back. "This isn't worth the paper it's written on. Montana Territory doesn't recognize warrants issued under such questionable circumstances." "She killed him," Jake insisted. "Shot him in cold blood." "Is that what Theodore told you?" Ivy spoke up, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Did he mention Samuel was drunk? That he came at me with a poker? That I have witnesses who saw the bruises your brother left on me week after week?" "Lies," Jake snarled. "Truth," Colt said quietly. "And if you'd really cared about your brother, you'd have stopped him from beating his wife. Instead, you're here trying to finish what he started, destroying her life." The crowd murmured. Sentiment clearly turning against the Texas men, Jake's hired guns exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing the shift in atmosphere. Judge Winters raised his voice. "Gentlemen from Texas, you have no legal standing here. Mrs. Brennan is a citizen of Montana Territory now. Under my protection and that of the law, I suggest you head back south before you find yourselves guests in our jail." For a moment, violence trembled in the air. Jake's hand hovered near his gun, his face mottled with rage, but his hired gun stepped back. Hands raised, wanting no part of a fight with an entire town. "This isn't over," Jake growled, but he was already backing toward the door. "Yes, it is," Ivy said, stepping forward despite Colt's attempt to hold her back. "It's over. Jake, your brother is dead because he was a cruel man who finally faced consequences. I'm not running anymore. I'm not hiding. If you come after me again, you'll face more than just my husband. You'll face the law, real law, not your brother's version of it." Jake stared at her for a long moment, perhaps seeing for the first time the woman his brother had tried to break but failed. Then he turned and stalked out, his men following. The saloon erupted in conversation, but Ivy barely heard it. She was shaking now, reaction setting in. Colt's arms came around her, holding her steady. "You were magnificent," he murmured in her ear. "So brave. I don't feel brave." She whispered back, "I feel like I might collapse. Then lean on me. That's what husbands are for." Judge Winters approached them, approval in his eyes. "Well done, both of you. I doubt those men will trouble you again. The kind of cowards who need 3-to-1 odds don't have the spine for a fair fight." They stayed in Cedar Ridge that night, guests of the Winters family who insisted on putting them up, Mrs. Winters fussed over Ivy like a mother hen, while the judge regaled Colt with stories of Montana Territory's growth, lying in the small guest room bed fully clothed and carefully apart despite being married. Ivy marveled at the day's events. This morning she'd been a fugitive. Tonight she was Mrs. Colt Brennan, protected by law and community. "You awake?" Colt whispered from his pallet on the floor. "Yes, thinking. About how different today was from my first wedding. Samuel was drunk before the ceremony even started. The preacher rushed through the words like he couldn't wait to be done. No one smiled. No one offered congratulations. She turned on her side, peering down at him in the moonlight. Today felt like a beginning instead of an ending. He reached up, finding her hand. It is a beginning, our beginning. Will Jake really give up? I think so. He's a bully, but not stupid enough to take on a whole territory. And without his brother pushing, without the family name at stake, yeah, I think he'll slink back to Texas and let it go. Then we're really free. Free as birds, Mrs. Brennan. Free to build that life we talked about. She squeezed his hand. I like being Mrs. Brennan. And I like you being Mrs. Brennan. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. Get some sleep, darling. Tomorrow we start looking for that land I mentioned. Start building our home. Home. The word settled into her heart like a seed finding soil. After years of mere existence, she was going to have a home, with a man who loved her, who'd stood between her and danger, who'd given her his name and protection without hesitation. Colt, she whispered. Thank you for everything, for saving me that day by the creek, for following me, for not giving up. Thank you for letting me, he replied, for trusting me, for saying yes. They lay in comfortable silence, hands still joined between bed and floor. Outside, Cedar Ridge settled into sleep, unaware that it had hosted a small miracle two broken people made whole by finding each other. Tomorrow would bring challenges. Building a life from nothing always did. But tonight, Ivy Brennan allowed herself to believe in happiness, in safety, in love that protected instead of punished. The ghost of Samuel Malone had been laid to rest at last. Not in Texas soil, but in a Montana saloon where his brother had been faced down by truth and community. And Ivy, who'd run so far and so hard, had finally found a place to stop, a place called home, in the arms of a man who'd proven that sometimes the best things came from the worst circumstances. Like flowers growing in harsh soil, their love had bloomed in the wilderness and would continue to grow, strong and true, for all the years to come. The confrontation in the saloon had unexpected consequences. Word spread quickly through Cedar Ridge about the Texas men who'd been faced down, and by morning, Colt and Ivy found themselves minor celebrities in the small town. People nodded respectfully on the street, and Mr. Henderson at the land office was particularly helpful when they inquired about available parcels. Got just the place for you, Henderson said, spreading a map across his desk. 160 acres along Willow Creek. About 10 miles north, good water, some bottomland for farming. Plenty of grazing. Previous owner abandoned it 2 years back, couldn't handle the winters. Colt studied the map with experienced eyes. Any trouble with the neighbors? Nearest ranch is the Double Bar, 5 miles east. Tom Morrison runs it. Good man, fair. He'll be glad to have decent folks nearby. Been some rustling problems lately, and extra eyes help. They rode out that afternoon to see the land. Mrs. Winters having insisted on packing them a lunch. The property was everything Henderson had promised. Rolling grassland dotted with groves of cottonwood and aspen. The creek running clear and cold along the western boundary. The cabin, however, was in ruins. The roof had partially collapsed, and animals had clearly been denning inside. Ivy stood in the doorway, trying not to let disappointment show on her face. We'll build new, Colt said, coming up behind her. Build it right, the way we want it. That stand of pines will provide good logs. By first snow, we'll have a proper home. She turned in his arms. We will. I promise. Might be small at first, but it'll be ours. Built with our own hands, filled with our own dreams. He gestured to a level spot near the creek. Right there, I think, kitchen window facing east to catch the morning sun. The way my mother liked. Ivy could see it in her mind's eye. A sturdy cabin, smoke rising from the chimney. Maybe a garden plot nearby. With a porch, she added. Where we can sit in the evenings. With a porch, he agreed, smiling. And a barn for the horses. Maybe a chicken coop for those layers you mentioned. They spent the rest of the day exploring their land, planning where things would go. By the creek, Colt showed her where they could build a spring house to keep food cool. On a rise overlooking the valley, they found the perfect spot for a small cemetery. Morbid, perhaps, but practical in this harsh land. As the sun began to set, they made camp near the ruined cabin. While Colt tended the horses, Ivy unpacked their supplies, humming softly. It was a tune her mother used to sing, half remembered from childhood. "That's pretty," Colt said, returning from the horses. "Don't think I've heard you sing before." "I haven't had reason to in a long time," she admitted. "Samuel didn't like me making noise." Colt's jaw tightened the way it always did when her late husband was mentioned. "Well, I love hearing you happy. Sing all you want, Mrs. Brennan." After their simple meal, they sat by the fire planning their immediate future. They'd need supplies from town, tools for building, perhaps hire a man or two to help with the heavy work. The money from selling Colt's extra horses would cover initial expenses, but they'd need income soon. "I can take work at neighboring ranches during roundup," Colt said. "And there's always hunting. The fort pays well for fresh meat." "I can take in sewing," Ivy offered. "Mrs. Winters mentioned the town needs a seamstress, and once we have chickens, eggs always sell well." They talked until the fire burned low, making lists and plans like any young couple starting out. But as bedtime approached, a new tension entered the air. They were married now. Truly married. There was no reason to maintain the careful distance they'd kept. Colt cleared his throat. "I'll just check the horses again." "Colt." Ivy stood, moving to intercept him. "We're husband and wife now." "I know, but—" He cupped her face gently. "You've been through so much. I don't want to rush you, don't want you to feel obligated." She silenced him with a kiss, pouring all her love and desire into the contact. When they broke apart, both were breathless. "I'm not that frightened girl anymore," she said softly. "You helped me find my strength again. I want this. I want you, my husband." His control broke then. He swept her into his arms, carrying her to their bedroll with a tenderness that made her heart ache. What followed was nothing like her experiences with Samuel. No rough handling, no selfish taking. Instead, Colt worshipped her with gentle hands and reverent kisses, making sure of her comfort and pleasure before seeking his own. Later, they lay entwined under the stars, skin cooling in the night air. Ivy traced patterns on Colt's chest, marveling at the solid reality of him. "I love you," she said, the words coming easier each time. "And I love you," he replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. "My brave, beautiful wife." They slept deeply that night, exhausted by travel and emotion and the sweet exploration of marriage. Ivy woke once to find Colt watching her, his face soft with wonder. "Can't quite believe you're real," he murmured when he saw her eyes open. "I'm real," she assured him, snuggling closer. "And I'm yours." "Forever?" "Forever." Morning brought the reality of hard work ahead, but also the joy of working towards something together. They returned to town for supplies, and word of their land purchase spread quickly. Several men offered to help with the cabin raising when the time came, the Western tradition of neighbors helping neighbors still strong. While Colt arranged for tools and materials, Ivy visited Mrs. Winters, who had offered to help set up the household basics. "You'll need good blankets for winter," the older woman said, leading Ivy through her store. "And a proper cook stove can't do with just a fireplace when the snow's 5 feet deep. Oh, and canning supplies. You'll want to put up preserves come berry season." The list grew overwhelming, but Mrs. Winters patted Ivy's hand reassuringly. "You don't need everything at once, dear. Build slowly. That's how we all started." As they worked, Ivy found herself opening up about her past, the words flowing easier than expected. Mrs. Winters listened without judgment, occasionally making sympathetic noises. "You're not the first woman to come west running from a bad situation," she said finally. "Won't be the last. What matters is what you do with your second chance. I want to do it right this time," Ivy said. Be a good wife. Build a good life. From what I've seen, you're already doing that. That man of yours looks at you like you hung the moon. And you stood up to those Texas bullies without flinching. You'll do fine. Over the following weeks, their new life took shape. Colt worked tirelessly on the cabin, cutting and hauling logs with the help of hired men from town. Ivy split her time between helping at the building site and taking in sewing work from the townswomen. The cabin rose quickly, one room at first, with plans to add more later. Colt was meticulous about the construction, making sure every log fit tightly. Every chink was properly sealed. "Build it right the first time," he'd say, "and it'll last our grandchildren." Grandchildren. The word sent a thrill through Ivy every time. The possibility of family, of generations, of roots sunk deep in this Montana soil. The day they moved in was crisp with early autumn. The cabin smelled of fresh wood and the pine tar they'd used for ceiling. Their possessions were few. The bed Colt had built, a table and 2 chairs. The cook stove Mrs. Winters had helped them find second-hand but serviceable. "It's perfect," Ivy breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "It's a start," Colt corrected, but he was smiling. "Give us a few years, and we'll have it just the way we want." That first night in their own home, they made love on their new bed, the fire crackling cheerfully in the hearth. Afterward, Ivy lay listening to the night sounds, so different from town noise. Just wind in the trees and the distant howl of wolves. "No regrets?" Colt asked softly. "None," she answered immediately. "You? Only that I didn't find you sooner." As autumn progressed, they settled into the rhythm of ranch life. Colt bought a small herd of cattle with the last of their money. Planning to build it slowly, Ivy started her garden plot, breaking the virgin soil with determination that matched any pioneer woman's. Their neighbors, the Morrisons, came to visit one Sunday, bringing a basket of apples from their orchard. Tom Morrison was a weathered man in his 50s. His wife, Mary, a comfortable woman who immediately took Ivy under her wing. "You need anything, you just holler," Mary said. "Winter can be hard for folks not used to it. I'll teach you about preserving meat, keeping vegetables in the root cellar, all the tricks for surviving till spring." The community embraced them. These hard-working people who understood about second chances and fresh starts. At the harvest dance in town, Ivy wore a new dress she'd made herself and danced every dance in her husband's arms, uncaring of the impropriety. But the past wasn't quite done with them. In late October, with the first snow dusting the mountains, a rider appeared at their gate. Ivy, alone while Colt was hunting, recognized him immediately. Not Jake Malone, but one of his hired guns from the saloon confrontation. Her hand went to the rifle by the door, but the man raised both hands peacefully. "Not here for trouble, Mrs. Brennan," he called. "Got a message from Jake Malone." "Say it from there," she replied, rifle steady in her hands. "Jake's dead. Killed in a bar fight in El Paso last month. But before he died, he wrote this." The man pulled out a letter, setting it on the gatepost. "Said to give it to you. Said to tell you, you're free, really free. Judge Theodore had a stroke when he heard about Jake. He's alive but can't speak, can't write, can't hurt anybody anymore." The man touched his hat brim and rode away, leaving Ivy staring at the letter. When Colt returned hours later with a deer slung over his saddle, he found her sitting on the porch, the letter in her lap. "What's wrong?" He was beside her instantly, rifle in hand, scanning for danger. She handed him the letter wordlessly. Jake's handwriting was shaky, probably written on his deathbed. "Mrs. Malone. I reckon it's Mrs. Brennan now. I'm dying, and a dying man ought to tell the truth. I know Samuel beat you. We all knew. Theodore said it was a man's right, but I saw your bruises. I'm sorry we didn't stop him. Sorry I came after you." "You were right to defend yourself. Live well. Be happy. You deserve it. Jake Malone." Colt pulled her into his arms as she cried, not from sadness, but from the release of a burden she'd carried so long. The Malone shadow was lifted at last. She was truly, completely free. That winter was hard. As Mary Morrison had predicted, snow piled high, temperatures dropped brutal low, and supplies ran thin. But inside their snug cabin, Colt and Ivy created their own warmth. They read to each other by firelight, made plans for spring expansion, and loved with the fierce joy of two people who'd found their salvation in each other. On Christmas Eve, Ivy gave Colt a special gift, the news that come summer, their family would grow by one. He stared at her in wonder, then whooped loud enough to scare the horses, sweeping her into a dance around their small kitchen. A baby, he kept saying. Our baby, our baby. She confirmed, laughing and crying at once. They made love that night with extra tenderness, Colt's hands reverent on her still flat belly. Outside, snow fell in silent curtains, blanketing their small ranch in pristine white. But inside was warmth and love and the promise of new life. Spring came late but glorious, the mountains exploding with wildflowers. Ivy, now showing her pregnancy, worked in her expanded garden while Colt and Tom Morrison built addition to the cabin, a bedroom for the baby, and a larger kitchen for the growing family they hoped to have. The day Ivy went into labor, a summer storm rolled through, reminding her of that night in Colt's first cabin. But this time, she wasn't afraid. Mary Morrison served as midwife. Colt paced outside like every expectant father. And just as the storm cleared, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry. "Sarah," Ivy said, cradling the tiny bundle. "For your first wife, so she's not forgotten." Colt's eyes filled with tears. "Ivy, you don't have to. I want to." "She was part of your journey to me. We'll tell little Sarah about both her namesake and her strong mama who survived so much to bring her into the world." They stood together on their porch that evening, baby Sarah sleeping in Ivy's arms, watching the sun set over their land. The cabin was snug behind them, the garden flourishing, cattle grazing peacefully in the meadow. They'd built this from nothing but determination and love. "Remember that day by the creek?" Colt asked softly. "When you nearly stepped on that rattler?" "How could I forget? You saved my life." He shook his head. "No, darling. We saved each other." And there, with their daughter beginning to fuss for her evening feeding, with chores still to do and a life to build, Colt and Ivy Brennan knew perfect happiness. Not because their life was easy, it wasn't, but because they'd chosen it, fought for it, and would protect it together for all their days. The Rattlesnake had brought them together, but love had made them whole. And in the vast wilderness of Montana Territory, two wounded souls had found their home at last, not in a place, but in each other's arms. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope Ivy and Colt's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine. Where are you listening from today? Please subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear what you thought about their romance and triumph over adversity. Until next time, partners.